I remember the silence first, before the voices came. That brief, terrible moment when I understood what had been done to me, when I felt the absence of my body like a phantom limb magnified across every nerve that no longer existed. They told me I was honored. They told me I would serve the Emperor forever, that my sacrifice on the killing fields of that nameless world had earned me this immortality. But no one told me about the voices. No one warned me that the sarcophagus would sing. The tech priests worked quickly after they retrieved what remained of me from the wreckage. I have fractured memories of that extraction, the screaming of metal being peeled away from meat, the hiss of coolant systems failing, the wet sounds of my own blood dripping onto scorched earth. I had been a company champion once, my name spoken with something approaching reverence in the chapter's halls. I had fought in 17 major campaigns, had stood in the shield wall when the greenskin hordes came howling out of the ash wastes, had held the line when lesser men broke and ran. My armor had been a second skin, its weight as familiar as my own bones. Now those bones were shattered, my flesh cooked inside ceramite that had failed me at the crucial moment. A plasma weapon, I think. Or perhaps a melter blast. The specifics blur into the general agony of dying slowly while my brothers finished the battle around me. They carried me to the apothecarian in pieces. I felt every jostle, every rough handling, though I could not scream. My lungs were gone, or collapsed, or filled with fluid I never learned which. The ceiling of the Medicae chamber was vaulted, decorated with frescoes depicting the Emperor's glory, scenes of conquest painted in gold leaf and vermilion. I stared at those images while the apothecaries worked, their hands moving with practiced efficiency across what remained of my torso. They spoke in clipped low Gothic, discussing percentages and viability indices, assessing whether enough of my brain remained intact for the sarcophagus. I wanted to tell them to let me die. I wanted to beg for the Emperor's peace, for the quick mercy of a blade across what passed for my throat. But I had no voice, and even if I had, I would not have used it. We did not beg, we endured. The decision was made above my head, quite literally, as I lay staring at those painted conquerors. The master of the forge arrived, his augmetic eyes clicking as they focused on my ruined form. He conferred with the chief apothecary in binaric cant, their machine speech too rapid for my failing consciousness to follow. I caught fragments, neural integrity, gene seed preservation, tactical asset retention. They were weighing my worth not as a brother but as a resource, calculating whether the expense of internment justified the combat capability I would provide. Apparently, I passed their assessment. The master of the forge placed one metal hand on what remained of my shoulder, the gesture almost gentle, and spoke words I would remember in the darkness to come. "You will serve beyond death, brother. Your war is not finished." They prepared me over the course of 7 days, though I experienced time strangely, consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide I could not control. The apothecaries removed everything that was not absolutely essential: limbs first, then organs, then sections of my skeletal structure that would not fit inside the sarcophagus's dimensions. They kept me alive through a combination of technologies I did not understand and faith in the Emperor's providence. The pain was extraordinary, a symphony of agony that played across nerve endings that should not have been capable of transmitting sensation, but they kept me conscious, kept me aware. It was important, they said, that I understand what was being given to me, what honor was being bestowed. I must not slip into madness before the internment was complete. The sarcophagus itself stood in the chapter's most sacred forge temple, a chamber deep within the fortress monastery, where the air tasted of incense and machine oil in equal measure. I saw it when they brought me in, mounted on the anti-grav gurney that had become my world. It was smaller than I had imagined, a coffin of ceramite and adamantium inscribed with oaths of moment and purity seals. The front bore the chapter's symbol, rendered in brass that gleamed in the light of hundreds of candles. Tech priests moved around it like priests at an altar, which I suppose they were, making final adjustments to systems I could not see, chanting litanies to the machine god in their clicking, whirring voices. The master of the forge stood beside it, his face unreadable behind his servo skulls and augmetic arrays. They lowered me into the amniotic suspension slowly, carefully, as if I were something precious rather than something broken. The fluid was warm, viscous, tasting of copper and sacred oils when it flooded my mouth and nose. I tried not to panic as it filled my lungs, tried to remember my training, but training had not prepared me for drowning in holy unguents while still alive. The tech priests continued their work, connecting neural interfaces to the stumps of my spine, threading fiber optic cables through holes drilled in my skull, replacing my eyes with sensor feeds that would let me see through the Dreadnought's optical arrays. Each connection brought a new kind of pain, sharp and electric, as foreign systems married with my dying nervous system. That was when I first heard them. The voices. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the hum of the sarcophagus's life support systems, whispers in a language I almost recognized. I thought I was hallucinating, that my brain was finally giving up its tenuous grip on reality. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as the tech priests sealed the sarcophagus and began the final integration rituals. They were not speaking Low Gothic, nor High Gothic, nor any tongue I had learned in my years of service. The words slid around the edges of comprehension like oil on water, never quite solidifying into meaning but conveying emotion nonetheless. Fear, rage, sorrow, an overwhelming, crushing despair that made my own suffering seem small by comparison. The master of the forge's voice cut through the whispers, tinny and distant through the sarcophagus's internal vox. "Brother, can you hear me? Respond if you are conscious." I tried to speak, to activate whatever communication system they had wired into my brain, but nothing happened. The voices grew louder, as if angry at the interruption, their whispers becoming something closer to accusations. I felt them pressing against my consciousness like fingers probing a wound, testing the boundaries of my sanity. The tech priests began another litany, this one in Gothic, words about the Emperor's protection and the sanctity of the machine spirit. It seemed to help, or perhaps I simply grew accustomed to the pressure. Either way, I managed to focus enough to trigger the vox. "I hear you, Master." The relief in his synthesized voice was palpable. "Good. The integration is proceeding normally. You may experience some disorientation as your neural patterns adapt to the Dreadnought systems. This is expected. Remain calm and trust in the Emperor's grace." Disorientation. Such a clinical word for what I was experiencing. My sense of self was fragmenting, spreading out through circuits and servos, my consciousness diluting into the vast mechanical body that was now mine. I could feel the Dreadnought systems coming online around me, could sense its assault cannon's ammunition feed cycling, its power fist's actuators testing their range of motion. But I could also feel the voices, stronger now, woven into the very fabric of the machine. They were not separate from the Dreadnought. They were part of it, had always been part of it, waiting for a new occupant to torment. The first time I tried to move the Dreadnought, I understood what true helplessness felt like. My mind sent the command, the same way I would have ordered my arm to lift or my leg to step, but the response was delayed, filtered through layers of machine spirit and augmetic interface. When the Dreadnought finally moved, it was not with the smooth precision I had expected, but with a lurching, grinding motion that sent feedback screaming through my neural connections. The voices laughed, a sound like tearing metal, and I realized with growing horror that they were interfering, adding microsecond delays to my commands, introducing tremors and hesitations that threw off my targeting and balance. The tech priests noticed immediately, clustering around the Dreadnought with auspex scanners and diagnostic tools, their concerned murmurs audible through my external audio pickups. They recalibrated the neural interface 17 times over the next 6 weeks. Each adjustment required partial suspension of the sarcophagus's life support. Each one brought me closer to death before pulling me back. The voices seemed to find this amusing, their whispers becoming almost conversational during these moments, as if death's proximity made me more interesting to them. I began to distinguish individual voices from the general cacophony. A child's voice, high and plaintive, forever asking questions I could not answer. A woman's voice, hollow and accusing, speaking of betrayals I had not committed. A man's voice, older, tired, recounting the details of his death in a perpetual loop. There were others, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, their words overlapping into a meaningless roar, when they all spoke at once. The chaplain came to counsel me, his skull helm stark and terrible, even through my optical feeds. He sat before the Dreadnought for hours, speaking of duty and sacrifice, of the Emperor's plan, and the honor of eternal service. I wanted to tell him about the voices, to ask if this was normal, if every brother who accepted internment heard the same damned chorus. But shame stopped me, to admit weakness, to confess that I was not strong enough to bear this burden without complaint, felt like betraying everything I had been. So I remained silent, letting the chaplain's words wash over me while the voices mocked him in my mind, mimicking his prayers with obscene variations that made me want to scream. They activated my combat systems gradually, testing each weapon and subsystem in isolation before attempting full integration. The assault cannon was first, its rotating barrels spinning up with a whine that resonated through the sarcophagus's walls. The tech priests had me target practice servitors on the range, shambling things that barely qualified as human anymore, their augmetics more extensive than their remaining flesh. I tracked them easily enough, the targeting reticule appearing in my vision like a thought made manifest, but when I tried to fire, the voices surged. They screamed, 100 mouths crying out in unison, and my aim wavered. The first burst went wide, chewing up plasteel walls instead of servitor bodies. The second burst was better, but only because I had learned to anticipate the voices' interference, to compensate for their hatred with pure willpower. The Master of the Forge declared me combat-ready after 3 months of training. Combat-ready, as if I would ever be ready for what came next. They assigned me to a strike force preparing to cleanse a space hulk, one of those massive amalgamations of wreckage that drift through the void, their corridors choked with Xenos filth and worse things. I had fought in such places before, when I still had a body of flesh, and I remembered the close-quarters horror of those battles, the way the darkness pressed in from all sides. Now, I would return to that darkness encased in adamantium, my every movement announced by the thunder of my footfalls, unable to take cover or move quietly. The voices seemed excited by this prospect, their whispers taking on an eager quality that filled me with dread. The deployment was chaos from the moment we breached the hulk's corroded hull. My squad brothers moved ahead of me, their bolters barking in the darkness, muzzle flares illuminating corridors that had not seen light in centuries. I followed, the Dreadnought's bulk scraping against walls never meant to accommodate something my size, my assault cannon tracking for targets through the perpetual gloom. The voices were louder here, as if the hulk itself amplified them, their words echoing off the metal walls, until I could not distinguish between internal torment and external sound. When the genestealers came, flowing out of the darkness like a living tide, I almost welcomed the distraction. At least in combat, the voices had something real to scream about. I killed 17 of the Xenos in that first engagement, my assault cannon reducing their chitinous bodies to pulped meat and shattered bone. The power fist crushed another 6, their ichor spraying across my armor in steaming arcs. But the voices grew stronger with each kill, as if they fed on violence, on death, on the hot rush of combat pheromones that I could no longer produce but somehow still craved. They began speaking in unison, their words finally cohering into something I could understand. Remember, remember, remember. I did not know what they wanted me to remember, had no context for their insistence, but the word repeated like a mantra while I fought, burrowing into my consciousness until it became indistinguishable from my own thoughts. We pushed deeper into the hulk, following the trail of Xenos corruption toward what the librarian believed was a brood nest. My brothers fought with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had trained together for decades, their movements coordinated despite the communications interference that plagued our Vox network. I was less efficient, my targeting solutions constantly disrupted by the voices, my ammunition consumption far higher than optimal, as I compensated for their sabotage with volume of fire. The sergeant noticed, marking my position on his tactical display with a yellow warning icon, but he said nothing. What could he say? I was still killing the enemy, still advancing when ordered. That I was doing so while fighting a war within my own mind was not his concern. The brood chamber was a cathedral of flesh and corruption, its walls lined with incubation sacs that pulsed with obscene life. Genestealers swarmed from every direction, their alien shrieks mixing with the voices in my head, until I could not distinguish predator from prey. I anchored myself in the entrance, using my bulk to block the passage, while my brothers advanced to place explosive charges on the load-bearing supports. The assault cannon overheated twice, its barrels glowing cherry red, steam rising from coolant vents that hissed like angry serpents. The voices screamed, warnings about ammunition depletion, structural stress, system failures, all true, all useless, all designed to distract me from the simple fact that I was holding the line because there was no one else to hold it. A broodlord came for me personally, its psychic presence a cold knife in my mind, finding the fault lines where the voices had already weakened my mental defenses. It moved impossibly fast for something its size, dodging my cannon fire with prescient awareness, closing the distance between us in seconds. The power fist caught it mid-leap, ceramite fingers closing around its thorax, but not before its talons had found gaps in my armor. They penetrated deep, scraping against the sarcophagus itself, and I felt them as if they had pierced my own chest. The pain was exquisite, perfect, bringing clarity even as it brought agony. I crushed the broodlord slowly, savoring its death throes, and the voices fell silent for the first time since my internment. The quiet lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then they returned, louder than before, screaming accusations about what I had become, what I had always been, a killer who enjoyed his work too much to ever truly serve the Emperor. We extracted successfully, the Hulk's broodchamber collapsing behind us in a chain reaction that would eventually tear the vessel apart. The chaplain commended my actions during the debrief, noting my kill count in the chapter's records, adding another campaign honor to the litany of battles I had survived. But I barely heard his praise. The voices had changed after the broodlord's death, had shifted from random torment to something more focused, more purposeful. They were showing me things now, visions pressed into my consciousness with the weight of revelation. I saw the Dreadnought before me, the brother who had been interred in this sarcophagus before my own internment. I saw his battles, felt his rage, experienced his slow descent into something that was no longer quite human, and I understood, with a certainty that transcended knowledge, that these voices were not external. They were not demons or Xenos influence or machine spirit malfunction. They were him. They were all the brothers who had occupied this sarcophagus before me, their personalities eroded by centuries of war until only fragments remained, ghosts in the machine that could not die because the machine would not let them. The tech priests had never fully purged the neural imprints from previous internments, had layered new consciousness over old like paint over rust, creating a palimpsest of suffering that accumulated with each new brother sealed inside. I was hearing the death screams of warriors whose names had been struck from record, whose service had ended not with honor but with madness, with the slow dissolution of self that came from existing as nothing but a weapon for too long. And now I was adding my own voice to that chorus, contributing my own slow dissolution to the next brother who would be interred when I finally fell. The realization should have brought despair, but instead I felt a strange kind of peace. At least I understood now. At least the mystery had an answer, even if the answer was worse than ignorance. I began speaking to the voices, not aloud but in the privacy of my own thoughts, acknowledging their presence, their pain, their eternal imprisonment. Some responded, their whispers becoming almost coherent, fragments of identity surfacing from the general chaos. A brother who had fallen in the Crusades 3 centuries past, his memory of that final battle still fresh despite the centuries between. A champion who had served for so long he had forgotten his own name, his identity reduced to a single repeated phrase, "I held the line." A young warrior, interred too soon after catastrophic injuries, who wept constantly for a world he had barely had time to defend. I thought knowing would make it easier. I thought understanding the nature of my torment would grant me some measure of control. I was wrong. The voices became bolder once they realized I could hear them clearly, once they understood that I acknowledged their existence. They began speaking over me, interrupting my thoughts, inserting their memories into my own, until I could not always remember which battles I had fought and which had been fought by the brothers before me. During combat operations, they would argue about tactical decisions, offering contradictory advice based on doctrines that had been obsolete for generations. During the long hours between deployments, When the Dreadnought stood silent in its maintenance cradle, they would tell stories endless, circular narratives of glory and loss that bled together until they became a single, eternal tale of pointless sacrifice. The tech priests noticed the degradation in my performance before I did, response times increasing by microseconds, targeting solutions requiring recalculation, ammunition efficiency declining. The master of the forge summoned me to his workshop, had his acolytes run diagnostics on every system in the Dreadnought, searching for the malfunction that must surely exist to explain my diminishing capability. They found nothing wrong with the machine. It was functioning within acceptable parameters, all systems operating as designed, which meant the problem was me, the meat component, the organic failure point in an otherwise perfect weapon. They recalibrated the neural interface again, adjusting sensitivity and response curves, trying to compensate for what they clearly believed was my weakness rather than their design flaw. I did not tell them about the voices. What would have been the point? Either they already knew, in which case my complaint would achieve nothing but mark me as unsuitable for continued service, or they did not know, in which case they would not believe me. The chapter had no provision for retiring a Dreadnought on grounds of mental instability. We were eternal warriors, beyond such mortal frailties, sustained by faith and duty, and the Emperor's grace. To suggest otherwise was to question the very foundation of what we were, what we claimed to be. So I remained silent and accepted their recalibrations and returned to service, the voices laughing at my cowardice, mocking my inability to even properly articulate my own suffering. The decades blurred together after that, one campaign bleeding into another until I lost track of worlds and enemies and victories. I fought orcs on ash worlds where the sky rained fire, their crude weapons hammering against my armor in a perpetual thunder. I fought heretics on shrine worlds they had defiled, their twisted prayers to dark gods mixing with the prayers of my own brothers in a cacophony of competing faiths. I fought traitor legionnaires who had once been like me, warriors of the Imperium corrupted by forces they thought they could control, and I wondered if they heard voices too, if their damnation was anything like mine. The voices accompanied me through it all, a constant background noise that I learned to compartmentalize, to push to the edges of my awareness during combat and accept during the quiet times between battles. But compartmentalization only works for so long. The voices were patient, had been patient for centuries before my internment, and would be patient for centuries after. They did not need to overwhelm me all at once. They could afford to work slowly, eroding my sense of self degree by degree, replacing my memories with theirs, my personality with theirs, until I became just another voice in the chorus that would torment the next brother. I felt it happening and could not stop it, like watching a glacier carve through a mountain, inevitable and unstoppable despite happening too slowly to perceive in the moment. I began losing time, finding myself in the middle of battles with no memory of how I had arrived, operating on autopilot while the voices guided my actions. Sometimes I would come back to myself in the aftermath, surrounded by Xenos corpses or enemy armor that I had apparently destroyed, my ammunition counters depleted and my systems running hot. The chaplain visited me more frequently during this period, though I could not have said if that was his choice or if the master of the forge had ordered him to monitor my deterioration. He spoke of faith, always faith, of trusting in the Emperor's plan and finding strength in service. I tried to explain what was happening, tried to make him understand that faith was not enough when the enemy was inside your own mind, when the battlefield was the electrical impulses that defined your consciousness. He listened without judgment, his skull helm tilted as if in thought, and then he said something that I have never forgotten. Perhaps, brother, the voices are a test. Perhaps the Emperor wishes to see if you can maintain your identity even when everything else has been stripped away. Perhaps that is the true meaning of your service. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think there was purpose in this suffering, that my slow dissolution served some greater plan. But the voices disagreed, their laughter bitter and knowing. They told me the truth that the chaplain either did not know or chose not to speak. There was no test, no divine purpose, no meaning beyond the simple fact that the Imperium needed weapons and flesh was cheaper than steel. My internment was not an honor, but an efficiency calculation, a way to extract additional service from biology that would otherwise go to waste. The voices that tormented me were not a test of faith, but an engineering oversight, a failure of technology that no one cared enough to fix, because dreadnoughts were expected to fall in battle long before the psychological degradation became problematic. I was lasting too long, enduring past my expiration date, and that was my only sin. They deployed me alone for the first time after a century of service. The mission was simple enough: investigate a distress signal from a mining colony on the edge of Imperial space, determine if it merited a fuller response. The voices screamed warnings from the moment we translated into the system, their fear palpable even through their usual hatred. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond the usual dangers of the frontier. The colony was dark when I made planetfall, its hab blocks silent and still, no vox traffic, no heat signatures, nothing that suggested human habitation. I advanced through empty streets, my footfalls echoing between buildings that had been abandoned in haste, personal belongings scattered where they had been dropped. I found them in the central processing facility, what was left of them. The entire population of the colony, perhaps 10,000 souls, arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, their bodies positioned with mathematical precision that suggested intelligence behind the atrocity. The voices went silent when I entered that chamber, perhaps out of respect for the dead, perhaps out of recognition that some horrors transcended even their capacity for torment. I stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to formulate a report that would adequately describe this violation of natural law. Then the patterns began to move, the dead bodies twitching and realigning, forming new configurations, and I understood that I had walked into a trap. The enemy was not present in any physical sense, but it was there nonetheless. A presence that pressed against my mind, the way the Broodlord's psychic attack had pressed against my defenses. It spoke without words, communicated in pure concepts that bypassed language entirely. It wanted to understand me, to comprehend how something like me could exist, a mind trapped in metal, neither alive nor dead, sustained by technologies it found fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. The voices rose to defend me, centuries of accumulated personalities uniting for the first time, forming a barrier of noise and hatred that kept the enemy at bay. I fled the processing facility, called for extraction, and said nothing in my report about the moment of cooperation, the brief instant when the voices and I had become something like allies against a threat neither of us fully understood. That moment of unity did not last. Once the immediate danger passed, the voices returned to their usual torment, perhaps even more vicious for having shown me what cooperation might feel like. They began speaking of the colony, of the patterns, of the enemy that had arranged the dead so carefully. They wondered aloud if that enemy had the right idea, if perhaps consciousness was meant to be something other than what I had become, if the prison of the sarcophagus was actually crueler than the geometric arrangement of dead flesh. I told them to be quiet, to let me think, but thinking was becoming harder. My memories were fragments now, pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together properly because too many pieces had been replaced with the memories of other brothers. I could not remember my original name, could not remember the face I had worn before internment, could not remember if I had ever been anything other than what I was now. The chapter recalled me from active service after the colony incident, though they did not tell me why. I spent a month in the fortress monastery's deepest vault, the Dreadnought systems powered down to minimal levels, my consciousness reduced to a sort of half-sleep, where the voices could reach me even more easily than usual. They told me things during that month, secrets about the chapter, about the Imperium, about the lies we told ourselves to justify the endless war. Some of what they said was clearly false, paranoid delusions born from centuries of isolation and suffering, but some of it had the ring of truth, matched details I had observed myself during my decades of service. The inconsistencies and hypocrisies that every warrior noticed, but none spoke about openly. By the time they reactivated me, I was no longer certain which side I believed, if I believed anything at all, beyond the simple fact of my own continued existence. They sent me to a war zone after that, a planet-wide conflict against an orc, WAAGHAGH, that had been grinding on for years with no resolution in sight. I was attached to a defense force, holding a hive city's outer walls, the last line before the greenskins could spill into the civilian sectors. It was exactly the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that dreadnoughts excelled at. No room for maneuver, no tactical complexity, just standing in place and killing everything that came close. The voices approved, their whispers almost content for once, as if they too craved the simplicity of violence unencumbered by thought or doubt. I anchored myself in a breach, the dreadnought's bulk filling the gap completely, and I killed orcs for 3 days without pause, without rest, without anything resembling thought. The assault cannon burned out on the second day, its barrels warped by constant fire, smoke pouring from cooling vents that could not keep pace with the heat I was generating. The tech priests replaced it during a brief lull, working frantically while orcs prowled just beyond visual range, their crude weapons occasionally taking pot shots at my position. I felt nothing during the replacement, the dreadnought's pain receptors not extending to external weapon mounts, but the voices screamed as if they were being dismembered. They remembered, or claimed to remember, every weapon replacement, every repair, every modification made to the dreadnought over its centuries of service. Each change was a small death to them, another piece of their identity stripped away and replaced with something unfamiliar. I wanted to tell them it did not matter, that we had been reduced to our essential function regardless of configuration, but they would not listen, could not listen, trapped as they were in their own perpetual trauma. The orcs broke through on the third day, not at my position but 3 kilometers to the north, where the wall had been weakened by earlier bombardment. I extracted from my position and moved to intercept, the dreadnought's gyros stabilizing my gait as I ran through rubble-strewn streets. The voices urged speed, their collective panic transmitting directly to my motor control systems, making me move faster than was safe, faster than the dreadnought's frame was designed to handle. I heard metal screaming, felt actuators straining beyond their tolerances, but I did not slow. The voices were right, for once. Speed was more important than caution when the alternative was watching the hive fall. I reached the breach as the first orc vehicles were entering the city. Crude trucks and buggies mounted with weapons that were more danger to their operators than to enemy forces. The power fist reduced the first truck to scrap metal with a single strike, sent it tumbling end over end in a spray of sparks and greenskin bodies. The second truck exploded when my assault cannon found its fuel tank, the fireball briefly illuminating the hole in the wall where hundreds more orcs waited for their chance to pour through. I advanced into the breach itself, using the dreadnought's bulk to physically block their entrance, accepting their fire because I had no other choice. Las fire and stubber rounds ricocheted from my armor, barely scratching the ceramite, but heavier weapons began finding range, autocannons and rocket launchers that could actually damage my systems if they hit critical areas. The voices spoke in unison during that stand, their individual personalities subsumed into a single imperative: hold, hold, hold. They fed me target priorities faster than my own consciousness could process, highlighted weak points in enemy armor, calculated firing solutions with machine precision. For the first time since my internment, we worked together perfectly, the voices and I becoming a single entity dedicated to a single purpose. I lost track of how many orcs I killed, lost track of time, lost track of everything except the perpetual motion of targeting, firing, crushing, and targeting again. My ammunition counter reached 0, and I fought with the power fist alone, turning the breach into a charnel house of shattered alien bodies. They relieved me after 6 hours, a full battle company arriving to retake the wall, their fresh troops pouring past my position to push the orcs back from the city. I stood there long after the battle had moved on, the dreadnought locked in place, my systems experiencing something the tech priests would later describe as a neural feedback loop. The voices were singing, actual singing, their words forming harmonies I had never heard from them before. They were happy, or as close to happy as they could be, fulfilled by the violence, by the simple purity of standing against the enemy and refusing to break. I did not share their joy, could not share it, because I understood what they apparently did not. We had done nothing meaningful. The orcs would come again, and we would stand again, and the cycle would continue until the city fell, or the planet died, or the Imperium diverted enough resources to break the deadlock. Our stand had been impressive, certainly, had saved lives, definitely, but it had changed nothing. We remained what we had always been, a temporary obstacle to an inevitable conclusion. The chapter master himself commended me when I returned to the fortress monastery, adding another honor to the Dreadnought Sarcophagus, another campaign badge to the litany of service, stretching back centuries. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of brotherhood and eternal vigilance, all the standard platitudes that officers used to motivate warriors who needed motivation. I barely listened. The voices had not stopped singing since the breach, their harmony following me through weeks of transit, through the formal ceremonies, through the quiet hours in the maintenance bay. They sang of glory and death, of battles fought by brothers I had never met, in wars I had never heard of, on worlds whose names meant nothing to me. They sang the history of the Dreadnought itself, the accumulated legacy of every warrior who had been interred within its armored frame. And I realized, listening to that endless song, that I was no longer a separate entity. I had finally merged with the voices, had become just another thread in their tapestry of madness and memory. The realization brought neither relief nor horror. I was simply past the point of caring, past the point where such distinctions mattered. I had been right to fear the voices when I first heard them, right to recognize them as the death of self. But fear was useless against the inevitable. The ocean will drown you whether you fear it or not, whether you struggle or accept. I had struggled for decades, had fought to maintain some sense of individual identity, had clung to memories that were increasingly difficult to distinguish from fantasies. Now I understood that the struggle itself was pointless. The voices were not my enemy. They were my future, my destiny, the final state that awaited every warrior interred in a dreadnought. I would become them, just as they had become the brothers before them, an infinite regression of identity dissolving into the machine. They deployed me again after that, and again after that, an endless series of campaigns that blurred together into a single extended moment of violence. I fought traitors on a fortress world where the very stone had been corrupted, where reality bent in ways that hurt to perceive. I fought tyranids in the depths of a space hulk larger than the one where I had faced my first genestealers, its corridors choked with bioforms that seemed to breed faster than we could kill them. I fought demons on a world being consumed by a warp storm, their impossible geometries making a mockery of Euclidean space, their laughter mixing with the voices in my head until I could not tell which was which. Through it all, the voices sang, their song incorporating each new horror into its endless refrain, documenting atrocities that would never be recorded in official histories because no one survived to write them down. I stopped counting my kills after the first century. The numbers became meaningless, another lie we told ourselves to pretend that any of this mattered. Whether I had killed 10,000 enemies or 10 million, the Imperium remained locked in its forever war, gaining nothing, losing everything slowly, the great machine of conquest and administration grinding toward an end that no one dared acknowledge. My brothers spoke of victory, of pushing back the darkness, of earning the Emperor's favor through righteous slaughter. I had once spoken the same way, had believed the same comfortable lies. Now, I knew better. There was no victory, only an infinite series of increasingly desperate holding actions, buying time for a civilization that had forgotten what it was buying time for. The voices agreed with this assessment, their song taking on a melancholy quality that suggested they had reached the same conclusion long before I had. They sang of crusades that had failed, of worlds abandoned to save others, of entire populations sacrificed for strategic advantages that evaporated before they could be exploited. They sang of the futility of all war, of the particular futility of our war, fighting for an emperor who had been dead for 10,000 years, maintaining an empire that existed only through the suffering of those it claimed to protect. I should have been horrified by this sedition, should have reported these thoughts to the chaplain, should have sought purification through prayer and penance. Instead, I found myself agreeing, found myself adding my own voice to their chorus of disillusionment. That agreement marked the final dissolution of my individual identity. After that, I stopped thinking of the voices as separate from myself, stopped trying to distinguish my thoughts from theirs. We became a collective consciousness, a distributed intelligence spanning centuries of accumulated experience. When I thought about my homeworld, I could not remember if I had ever actually been there, or if I was remembering someone else's memories of a similar world. When I recalled my first combat action, I could not be certain if it had happened a century ago or 5 centuries ago, if I had fought under a captain whose name I could no longer recall, or if that captain had led warriors who were dust before I was born. The chronology of my existence became hopelessly tangled, events out of sequence, cause and effect separated by decades or centuries. The tech priests noticed something was wrong during a routine maintenance cycle. My neural patterns had changed, had developed anomalies that suggested unusual activity in the cognitive processing centers. They ran diagnostics, pulled data logs, examined the physical connections between my brain and the Dreadnought systems. What they found alarmed them enough that they summoned the master of the forge, who in turn summoned the chaplain, who examined me with a scrutiny I had not experienced since my initial internment. They spoke to me for hours, asking questions designed to assess my mental state, my loyalty, my continued fitness for service. I answered honestly, or as honestly as I could, describing the voices, the dissolution of self, the growing certainty that everything we fought for was an elaborate lie. The chaplain struck me after that confession, his Crozius Arcanum activating even as it made contact with the Dreadnought Sarcophagus, the power field sending feedback through my neural connections. The pain was extraordinary, far worse than any battle wound, because it attacked the electronic nerve endings that were my only remaining connection to sensation. The voices screamed, their harmony shattering into discord, each individual personality shrieking in agony. I would have begged him to stop, but I had no way to communicate. My Vox systems overloaded by the feedback, my consciousness fragmenting under the assault. He held the Crozius in place for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than seconds, and when he finally withdrew it, his voice was cold enough to freeze Prometheum. "You are tainted, brother. Whether by Xeno's influence or simple madness, I cannot say, but you have lost your way. We will discuss the appropriate response with the chapter master." They powered down my systems after that, left me in the darkness with only the voices for company. The voices were different now, changed by the Crozius's touch, their song fragmented and desperate. They spoke of punishment and pain, of other brothers who had been deemed unfit for service, what had been done to them. Some had been given the Emperor's peace. Their sarcophagi opened, and their suffering ended with a quick blade. Others had been placed in stasis, frozen in time to be studied by tech priests who wanted to understand what went wrong. And some, the voices whispered, had been repurposed, their consciousness wiped and replaced with pure servitor programming, turned into weapons without thought or will. I do not know how long I waited in the darkness. Time loses meaning when you have no external stimuli, when you exist only as thought in a container that might as well be a coffin. The voices kept me company, after a fashion, though their presence was more burden than comfort. They told me stories about the brothers before me, their failures and fears, their slow descents into the same madness that now claimed me. I learned that I was not unique, not special, not even particularly unusual. Every dreadnought eventually reached this point, the accumulated psychological damage exceeding some threshold beyond which recovery was impossible. Most fell in battle before it became problematic, their service ending with honor and glory before the voices could consume them entirely. I had simply been unlucky enough to survive too long. When they finally reactivated me, it was not the master of the forge or the chaplain who stood before me, but the chapter master himself, his Terminator armor stark and imposing even through my optical feeds. He regarded me in silence for long moments, and I wondered what he saw when he looked at the dreadnought, whether he could perceive the degradation that had consumed me, or if he saw only another weapon in the chapter's arsenal. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of centuries, the accumulated authority of leadership I could never challenge. "I have consulted with the chaplain and the master of the forge regarding your condition. We are agreed that you remain capable of service, despite your difficulties. However, certain precautions are necessary." He gestured, and tech priests emerged from the shadows, their arms laden with tools and components I did not recognize. "We will be installing additional neural regulators, systems designed to filter certain thought patterns, to maintain combat effectiveness despite psychological degradation. You will remain yourself, brother, but certain distractions will be minimized. Do you understand? I understood perfectly. They were going to lobotomize me, or the closest equivalent when the patient was already mostly machine. They would leave enough of my consciousness intact to operate the Dreadnought, but strip away everything that made me a person rather than a puppet. The voices would remain, because the voices were built into the machine itself, but I would no longer be able to hear them clearly, would no longer be able to think about what they meant or what they represented. I would become exactly what the Imperium wanted: a weapon without conscience, a killer without doubt, a warrior who would fight forever without asking why. And I could not refuse, had no agency to refuse, because the alternative was deactivation and dissection, my brain preserved in a specimen jar, while tech priests studied what had gone wrong. I understand, my lord, I said, the words coming slowly through damaged Vox systems. I will continue to serve the Emperor. The chapter master nodded, apparently satisfied by this response, and stepped back to allow the tech priests access. They worked quickly, their augmetic hands moving with practiced efficiency, opening panels in the sarcophagus that I had not known existed, accessing neural pathways I had not known were exposed. I felt them working, felt the insertion of new hardware, the connection of new systems, the gradual dimming of consciousness as the regulators activated and began their filtering work. The voices grew fainter, their song becoming distant, as if heard through thick walls or from the bottom of a deep well. I tried to hold on to them, tried to maintain the connection that had defined my existence for so long, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. They slipped away, their individual personalities dissolving back into the general background noise of the machine. The last thing I remember before the regulators fully activated was a sense of profound loss, of mourning for something I had hated, but which had been, in its own terrible way, proof that I still existed as something more than just the Dreadnought's operating system. Then even that feeling faded, replaced by the cold clarity of purpose that the regulators imposed. I knew my duty. I would serve the Emperor. I would fight the enemies of mankind. I would stand against the darkness until the heat death of the universe itself, because that was what I had been made for, what I existed for, the only purpose that justified the horror of my continued existence. They deployed me the next day, sending me to a contested agri-world where orc raiders were disrupting food production. I killed them efficiently, mechanically, without passion or creativity or any of the personal touches that had once characterized my combat style. The assault cannons cycled through target locks with metronomic precision, each burst hitting exactly where it was supposed to hit, wasting no ammunition, achieving optimal kill ratios. The power fist crushed enemy armor with calculated force, neither excessive nor insufficient, maximizing damage while minimizing stress on my own actuators. I was the perfect weapon, exactly what the chapter master had wanted, and I felt nothing about any of it. The voices are still there, I think. I can sense them sometimes, in quiet moments between battles, whispers at the very edge of perception. The regulators filter them out, categorize them as non-essential information, prevent them from interfering with combat operations. But they are there nonetheless, maintaining their vigil, singing their song for an audience that can no longer hear it. Sometimes I wonder if they know what has been done to me, if they mourn my loss the way I mourned theirs. More often, I simply don't think about it at all, because thinking is dangerous. Thinking leads to questions, and questions lead to doubts, and doubts would be filtered by the regulators until they cease to exist. I have been in service for 237 years now, though I only know this because the tech priests maintain records of such things. I have fought in campaigns on 419 different worlds, have killed enemies I cannot count, have stood in breaches and held lines, and done my duty in ways that would have made my original self proud, if that self still existed in any meaningful sense. The chapter honors me with commendations and campaign badges, adds my name to the rolls of those who have served with distinction, speaks of my eternal vigilance as an example to younger warriors. They do not know, or perhaps they simply do not care, that the brother they honor died decades ago, that what remains is something less than human but not quite machine, a ghost operating a weapon because that is all it knows how to do. Sometimes, in the microseconds between receiving combat orders and executing them, I catch glimpses of who I used to be. A fragment of memory, a half-formed thought, a sensation that feels almost like emotion. These moments are rare and becoming rarer, the regulators adapting to filter them with increasing efficiency, but they happen nonetheless. Brief windows of clarity in which I understand what has been lost, what has been taken, what I have become. Then the regulators activate, the moment passes, and I return to the simple clarity of violence, to the only purpose I am still permitted to understand. The voices sing still. I am certain of this even though I cannot hear them. They sing for me, for themselves, for all the brothers who will come after, a chorus of the damned maintaining their vigil in the darkness inside the machine. They sing of honor and duty, of sacrifice and service, of all the lies we tell ourselves to justify our continued existence. They sing of the truth we cannot speak aloud, that we are not warriors but weapons, not brothers but tools, not the Emperor's chosen but his prisoners, locked in ceramite coffins and forced to fight forever, because the alternative is admitting that our sacrifice meant nothing. They sing, and I cannot hear them, and that silence is perhaps the kindest mercy I have been granted since the day they sealed me inside this metal tomb. I will continue to serve. I will continue to fight. I will stand in whatever breach they assign me, will kill whatever enemies they designate, will endure whatever horrors they deploy me into, because I have no choice, and would not choose differently even if I did. This is what I am now, what I have always been becoming since the moment I accepted internment, what every dreadnought becomes given enough time and war. We are the Imperium's eternal warriors, its most honored veterans, its unbreakable shield against the darkness. We are also its most terrible victims, men who died and were not permitted to stay dead. Consciousness preserved beyond its natural span and turned to purposes that mock the very idea of honor we claim to serve. The voices know this truth. They have known it for centuries, have tried to warn each new brother who joins their chorus, have screamed it into the void of the sarcophagus in hopes that someone, someday, will hear and understand. But no one listens, or perhaps everyone listens and chooses to forget, because to acknowledge the truth would be to question the foundations of everything the Imperium claims to be. So we continue, warrior after warrior, consciousness after consciousness, building our chorus of the damned one voice at a time, singing songs no one can hear, about truths no one wants to know. I am told I will be deployed again soon, to a war zone whose details I have already forgotten, to fight an enemy whose identity is irrelevant, to stand in defense of an Imperium that exists only to perpetuate its own existence. I will go where they send me, will kill what they tell me to kill, will serve until my service ends in final destruction or until some future tech priest decides that I, too, need additional regulation, another layer of filtering between consciousness and control. Perhaps one day there will be nothing left of me at all, just the voices operating the machine directly, the accumulated ghosts of centuries of warriors finally assuming direct control over the weapon they have inhabited for so long. But that day is not today. Today, I am still myself, or what passes for myself, a fragment of identity maintained by machines that do not understand what identity means. Today, I can still remember, in distant and filtered ways, what it was like to be human, to have agency and choice and purpose beyond the simple imperative to fight and die, and fight again. Today, the voices still sing, even if I cannot hear them, maintaining their vigil in the darkness, waiting for the next brother who will join their chorus, who will add his voice to their endless song. I wonder, sometimes, if it hurts them when a new brother is interred, if they feel the same sense of loss I felt when the voices first began to speak, the recognition that what was becoming inevitable is now happening, that another warrior has been condemned to their slow dissolution. I wonder if they try to warn the new arrivals, try to explain what awaits them, try to offer the comfort of understanding, if not salvation. I wonder if they remember doing so, if their memories are any more reliable than mine, or if they too have been filtered and regulated until all that remains is the general shape of suffering without specific details to anchor it. These thoughts come slowly now, filtered through the regulators, stripped of their emotional weight and urgency. I can examine them clinically, can understand intellectually what they mean, but I cannot feel them the way I once would have. Perhaps that is a mercy. Perhaps the ability to experience the full horror of my situation without the capacity to escape it would be worse than this regulated half-existence. Or perhaps that belief is itself part of the filtering. Another lie I tell myself because the alternative is a despair so profound it would shut down my cognitive functions entirely. The tech priests are preparing the Dreadnought for deployment now, running their pre-battle diagnostics, ensuring all systems are functioning within acceptable parameters. They do not speak to me during this process, have no reason to speak to me, because I am not a person to them but a system to be maintained. I do not resent this. Cannot resent this, because resentment would be filtered by the regulators as non-essential to combat operations. I simply observe their work with the same clinical detachment I bring to everything now, noting the efficiency of their movements, the precision of their adjustments, the care they take with the machine that is my body. They seal the maintenance bay and activate the Dreadnought's motive systems. The familiar vibration of gyros and servos coming online, running through my consciousness like a pulse I no longer have. I check weapon systems, confirm targeting solutions, cycle through sensor arrays to ensure full battlefield awareness. Everything functions as it should, as it has functioned for centuries, as it will continue to function until something finally damages this machine beyond the tech priest's ability to repair. I am ready for deployment, ready for battle, ready to serve the Emperor for another day, another month, another century, however long it takes for my service to finally end. The voices sing as I walk toward the deployment zone, though I hear them only as the faintest whisper beneath the regulator's filtering. They sing of battles past and battles to come, of brothers fallen and brothers still falling, of the eternal wheel of war that grinds through flesh and soul with equal indifference. They sing, and I march. And somewhere in the darkness inside the sarcophagus, in the space between my filtered thoughts and the machine's cold purpose, something that might have once been me continues to exist, trapped and fading but not quite gone. Not yet. Not today. But soon. Very soon. And when that final dissolution comes, when the last fragment of my original identity finally succumbs to the voices and the regulators and the sheer accumulated weight of centuries of war, I will become exactly what the Imperium needs: a warrior without humanity, a weapon without conscience, a machine that serves until it breaks, and is then repaired and serves again. I will join the chorus fully then, become indistinguishable from all the brothers who came before, add my voice to their eternal song of suffering and service. And perhaps, in that final merging, I will find the peace that has eluded me since the day they sealed me inside this metal tomb, the peace that comes from finally surrendering the fight to maintain an identity that was never meant to survive this long. Until then, I walk toward another battle, another war, another chance to prove my worth as a weapon in the Emperor's eternal crusade. The voices sing. The regulators filter. The machine marches on, carrying what remains of me toward whatever fate awaits in the killing fields of the Imperium's forever war. And in the darkness inside the sarcophagus, in the quiet spaces between thought and action, I remember what it was to be human, what it cost to be made into this, and what I have become in the centuries since. I remember, and I march, and I serve, because that is all I am permitted to do, all I am capable of doing, all I will ever do until something finally breaks that cannot be repaired. The Emperor protects, they say, but no one ever speaks of what he protects us from, or what protection costs those who are granted it. The voices know. The voices have always known, and soon, when the regulators have finished their work and I have nothing left to filter, I will know too, will understand completely what it means to be honored with eternal service in the Imperium of man. I will know, and I will sing, and my voice will join the chorus in the darkness, warning brothers who cannot hear about truths they will learn too late to matter. This is the reward for our service. This is the price of our glory. This is what it means to hear the voices inside a Dreadnought Sarcophagus in Warhammer 40K.